Welcome back, everyone, to another segment of Rabbi Jeff's Pirkei Avos Perek, where we attempt to understand the meaning behind the instructions of our sages and how it's relevant to our lives today. We do this, of course, using the thoughts of our teachers before us and try to make them applicable to our times. Feel free, please, to contact me with any comments or questions at rjfromlj@aol.com. Okay, this Mishna is a very difficult Mishna. Very difficult only because there are so many pieces of this Mishna, and it's very complicated to understand what the message is that the Mishna is trying to teach me. Okay, so let's begin. So Mishna says, Benoshel Rabbi Gamliel Benoshel Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi Omer, that Yafeh Talmud Torah, that the study of Torah is Yafeh, it's good. Now I have to stand and on many of these words, but I'm going to do that after I read through the Mishnah. So Yafeh Talmud Torah im Derech Eretz, that Talmud Torah is good along with Derech Eretz. We're going to translate Derech Eretz here as a job, as Derech Eretz, as the way of the world, which means a livelihood. There are other ways to translate Derech Eretz, sends the Mishnah into a different spin, but most of the Mefarshim understand that Derech Eretz here means livelihood. So Torah is good with a livelihood, sheyigias shneim mishkachas avon, because putting effort into both of them chases away sin, makes sin be forgotten. V'chol Torah she'eni malacha, any Torah that doesn't have malacha, that doesn't have work with it, sofa betela, in the end, the Torah is going to be nullified and abandoned, v'goreres avon, and is going to cause sin. V'kol ha'amelim imatzibur, and anybody who works for the congregation, for the community, yiyu amelim imoy l'shem shamayim, should work for them for the sake of heaven. Shezechus avosam misayatam, because the merit of their forefathers stands with them. Vitzidkosam omedes la'ad, the righteousness stands forever. V'atem male ani alechem, and you, the workers, I consider it for you, sachar harbe, great reward, ki'ilu asisem, as if you have done everything you've needed to do. In truth, there is not a part of this Mishnah that on the surface makes sense. And let's start from the beginning. First of all, Yafeh Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah is good. What do you mean good? Is that a suggestion? Eitzah Tova Kamash Malan? It's good to get a job. It's good, along with your Torah, that you also make a parnasa. And if you don't, it's also okay. Like, are you telling me a suggestion? Are you telling me an ethical imperative? Are you telling me the way that life has to be? Why would the Mishnah use such a soft word as Yafeh? It's like a nice idea to have Talmud Torah with Derech Eretz. It's either the right way or not the right way. Either it's learning only, or it's working, or it's learning and working is a good idea. But what does this mean, Yafeh? Tell it to me as an imperative. You must work and learn. But why say the word Yafeh? Too soft. Problem number one. Problem number two. It's good to work and to learn, because but putting yourself into both of them is going to be mishkachas avon. It's going to chase away sin. Well, if learning Torah chases away sin, and if working chases away sin, why work? Just learn Torah. Or why learn Torah? Just work. In other words, both of them have the ability to be able to chase away sin. Why do I need both of them? My third problem. Sheyigias shneim mishkachas avon v'chol Torah, and any Torah, she'eni ma malacha, that doesn't have with it malacha, any Torah that doesn't have work with it, sofa betela, in the end it's going to be batal, v'goreres avon. It's going to cause sin. So I have two problems here. My first problem is, let's look at the words carefully. V'chol Torah. By the way, we are obligated to learn Pirkei Avos this way. Notice, as I've mentioned from the very beginning, that the messages of Pirkei Avos are buried deeper than the surface. That means we have to look at the surface and we have to rake up the surface and say, what is this not saying to me? What sense is this not making to me? V'chol Torah she'eini ma malacha. What do you see there? You see a problem there? Look at those words again, please. Look at the beginning of the Mishnah. Yafet Talmud Torah im derech eretz. Now we're saying Kol Torah she'eini ma malacha. So wait a second. Why not use the same word? Why did we switch from derech eretz to malacha? Why don't we use the same word for both? If derech eretz means work, means livelihood, then say livelihood in both places. If derech eretz is something different than malacha, then I can understand why you would use two different words. What's going on here? But I have a bigger problem. That it says, what it's saying to me is that if you're not working and learning, so then in the end you're going to commit crimes. Rashi says that the reason is because you're going to become impoverished. When you become impoverished, you're going to need to make a living. You're going to immediately go and steal from people so that you can support yourself. Now, stop and think for a second. Who are we talking to here? A person that's learning Torah. A person that's learning Torah runs out of money. What do we expect him to do? Steal? Why not like the simple thing? A person who's learning Torah runs out of money. He goes and gets a job. Like, why do we assume that he's going to go and steal? Like, what are we saying about the quality of people that are learning Torah? It doesn't make sense. You're telling me that a person that's learning Torah, right, called Torah she'eini ma malacha. So you've got Torah already, right? But you don't have malacha. You don't have a parnasa. You don't have a way to make a livelihood. And then what are we saying about you? Go reres avon. You're going to end up stealing. Why are you going to end up stealing? Why isn't it you just go look for a job, or you're gonna do something else first? You're going to beg. You're going to ask people to help you, but you're not going to go and steal. That's not the absolute outcome. The next step of what happens when a person runs out of money, they go and steal. Plenty of poor people have never stolen a thing in their lives, are makbid about not stealing. I'll tell you an amazing story. We had, when I was learning in yeshiva here, so there used to be a fellow who would come to the yeshiva and he would sell tzitzis. Clearly a beggar, a Jerusalem beggar. And he would come, and instead of walking around the yeshiva asking for handouts, he would make tzitzis for people. And he would charge a little extra than what you would pay in a store. And he would tie the tzitzis right there in the back of his medrash, and you would get a pair of tzitzis. And a lot of people did this. It was a great thing. One time I'm sitting with my chavrusa. My chavrusa is from Los Angeles. Would know him, Rabbi Schwartzmer. And Rabbi Shmuel and I are sitting and learning, and we're arguing about something. This guy walks over and he says, no. He says to my chavrusa, thank God. He says, you've got it wrong. He said, the Rashba says like this, the Ritva says like that, Taisa says like this, but I think that this is the proper pshat. This is the proper understanding. And he gives him like a whole dissertation. Now, you don't expect this coming from a person who's, whatever, looks like, one of the regular beggars of Yerushalayim. Turns out, who is this guy? This guy was a dayan in Europe. Unfortunately, saw terrible, horrific things in front of his eyes. And when he came to Eretz Yisrael, he could never make it. He just never got his life back on track. And this is what he was doing. But he was an incredible Talmid Chacham. But he was much more. We invited him to come to lunch, and he said no. So we said, no, for sure this guy hasn't eaten in a long time. Said, come to lunch. He says, I don't have permission. I can't just eat the food in the yeshiva. So we said, no, we can give you permission. So he looked at us and he said, you're not the Balabatim. So we went to the Rosh Yeshiva and we asked him, and he said, of course, bring the guy in. Now in that yeshiva, it happened to be that the way they would serve is that there were 10 guys sitting around a table. They would serve enough food for 8. Because they made an assumption that 2 guys weren't going to be so hungry, so they didn't want to waste anything, so they put out less food than what was here. They put out 8 portions. This could take me an hour to tell, so I'm not going to tell the whole story. At the end of the day, they put oranges on the table. Now, these oranges were Biafran oranges. Like, these were emaciated oranges. They were nothing that you would look at and go, wow, isn't that amazing? So we told the guy, take an orange. So the guy counts, and he says, there's not enough oranges. So we told him again, I don't need oranges. He doesn't need oranges. There's going to be leftover. Please take the orange. The guy takes the orange. And he looks at the orange. Now, you have to understand what this guy looked like. Like the worst of the Aniyim in Yerushalayim that look like they haven't changed their clothes in weeks. And that they when they changed their clothes, all they did was turn them inside out. Like, that's what this guy looked like. He picks up the orange. He looks at the orange and he says, oh, like this, rubs it against his beged, puts it in his briefcase, and he says, Ze bishvil Shabbat. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable. That when a person is a Torah person and they're impoverished, why is the Mishnah assuming that they're going to immediately run to theft? A person like that is going to run to many other things long before they're going to run to theft. So what is the Mishnah saying? That if you don't have malach, if you don't have a job, so the mishkachas oven is going to cause you to sin. Okay. That's my first part, my problem with the first part of the Mishnah. But then, then it says that anybody who works for the community should work for the community for the sake of heaven. Well, having worked for a community for my entire life, there could be no other motivation for a person to work for a community. Right? What is the Mishnah saying? Oh, by the way, let me just warn you, when you work for the community, do it for the sake of heaven. For Shteitzach, you're going to do it for the sake of heaven. A person gives up many, many things to be able to be there for a community, then of course that's for the sake of heaven. Plus, why do you have to tell me that somebody who works for the community has to be for the sake of heaven? Isn't everything we do for the sake of heaven? Aren't we commanded later in Pirkei Avos? Kol ma'asecha, everything you do has to be l'shem shamayim, has to be altruistic and for the sake of heaven. Why are you warning this guy that he has to do it for the sake of heaven? And look at the reason. What if you, without looking at the Mishnah, ladies and gentlemen, what do you think you would say would be the reason that you have to work for the community for the sake of heaven? Because there's very little rewards and it's a difficult job to keep everybody happy, to work for people, to give yourself over to people. It's not a simple thing to do. And therefore, you have to have one motivation. It can't be your own covet because that's going to get destroyed. It can't be monetary gain because that's not going to happen. It can't be fame and fortune. It's not going to happen. So the only thing that can motivate you to do that, the only thing is that you have to be doing it for the sake of others. Okay, that's what I would say. But that's not what the Mishnah says. Let's look at the Mishnah. Why is it you have to work for them for the sake of heaven? Because they have merits of their forefathers on their side. So what does that mean? They're a formidable opponent? That means that they could beat you, they could win you. So be careful, don't start up with your community because they're going to trounce you. Like, what does that mean? Because they have the schus avosa misayatam, they have the help of God on their side, and therefore you have to be working for the sake of heaven? Vitzit kosam omeres la'ad, and the righteousness stands forever. So what? Why should that dictate whether I work for the sake of heaven or not work for the sake of heaven? Some things, some because is off here. The wording of the Mishnah is off here. I'm going to treat it as if you really did it. Well, I did it. The person who works for the sake of heaven works for the community, worked for the community. They gave their life to the community. What does it mean? I'm going to consider it as if you really did give your life to the community. But I did. So what does it mean? Does everybody understand? These are not brilliant questions. These are not deep questions. This is just taking a dusting feather over the Mishnah and saying, okay, beyond the words, what's the Mishnah saying to me? What's the theme of this Mishnah? I have successfully, I think, pointed out, or not when I say successfully, they haven't necessarily been good answers, but I have attempted and done at each Mishnah given a theme. Knows what's the theme? What's the connective tissue in this Mishnah? What's the theme of this Mishnah? What's the message that Rabbi Gamliel, B'nai Shel Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is trying to teach me? Okay, I have to lay down a principle. We'll see how long that takes. And I realize it's 9 o'clock in the morning. Not necessarily the time yet for deep existential questions. I understand on top of a mountain in Nepal is probably the better place to ask this question. But we have to ask the question. And we have to ask the question often to ourselves. Why did God create humanity? When I learned in yeshiva, there was a fellow who cleaned the yeshiva. He was in charge. It was a very big yeshiva. It was a huge campus. He had a whole staff of people that worked for him. He ran around in a car, in a truck with lights. I mean, he was a really chashuv guy. And he took his job very seriously. And he used to say, his name was Mr. Berlin. Mr. Berlin used to say, the yeshiva would run much better and be a much cleaner place if there were no boys in it. Now, it's true. Can you imagine God must say that every once in a while about the world? God, this would be such a great world if it wasn't for the human beings. We're a difficult lot. A tough bunch of customers. Why did God create us? Well, he needed G.I. Joes and Barbies. He needed like little dolls to play with. Why did God create human beings? It's a very, very important existential question. Not just what am I doing here, but just let's kind of get into God's head. Why did God feel motivated to create a human? So to put it succinctly and in short terms, the Svarim say that the reason why God created the world was because he wanted to be a meitiv l'zulaso. He wanted to be able to do good for us. God is inherently good. Inherent goodness needs to be shared. That's part of the quality of goodness. And therefore, part of God's inherent characteristic is that he needs to be meitiv, that he needs to be able to give over to others. And therefore, he created human beings so that he could successfully be a meitiv, that he could give it over to them. If that's the case, then creation is the greatest act of God's kindness, because he created the world to bestow his goodness and kindness onto us, which means the very act of creation was an act of kindness. Creating the brooks, the streams, creating the mountains, creating the trees, vegetation, creating the universe, creating the orbs, all of that was done in order to be able to create man so that he could give to man, which means that all of this was part of the chesed, part of the kindness that he was doing for man. If this is a world of kindness, then why is it that in the beginning chapter of Genesis, all we meet is the God of justice? Bereshis bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. We know that God has many different names. The name Elohim is the name of God's justice. It's the Midas Hadin. Adonai Yud Hei Vav Hei, that's the Midas HaChesed. It's the God's attribute of mercy, of kindness. Why, if it's a world of kindness? If Olam Chesed Yibaneh, if the whole thing is about building a world of kindness, being a meitiv, giving over to human beings, if the whole creation of the world was itself an intrinsic act of kindness, then why is it that God created it with din? Why did he create it with justice? Our rabbis explain that the reason is because God realized that man couldn't handle a world of justice. A world of justice is a world of black and white. It's either 100% or zero. And if it's not 100%, then it's nothing. Man can't do that. If anyone has ever taught, you know this very, very well, that we always are looking for, a few more points. It can't be black and white. You give a test and you give the test back to the student. Student comes up and says, I don't think I should have gotten a 73. I think I should have gotten a 73 and a half because I didn't put all the letters, but I had most of the letters of the sentence in there. They were jumbled, I understand, but if you really anagram them, you're going to see I really had sort of the right answer on a Wednesday. Like it was. Thank you very much. But that's what human beings are. We're always bargaining. We're always looking to push ourselves a little bit more, to get a little more. We can't live in a world of black and white. If we live in a world of 100 or 0, we're going to fail all the time. We need to be in a world where you can get a B+. We need to be in a world where you can get partial credit for something. When God realized that there were human beings in the world that were given free choice, which we'll talk about in a second, God decided that he had to mitigate that justice with mercy and kindness. And that's why in the second chapter of Genesis, when God talks about the creation of man in detail, it says, Adonai Elohim. It introduces God's midas HaChesed along with his midas Hadin. But why is Chesed mitigated with Din? Why is it so harsh? Just do Chesed. If you realize that I can't live on Din, then get rid of the Din and just raise me on Chesed. So this is a critical principle. There's a concept called Nama de Kisufa. Nama de Kisufa means the bread of shame. When I give you something for nothing, its real ultimate intrinsic value is nothing. As much as we love to win prizes, as much as we love to get gifts, at the end of the day, those things that we didn't work for, those things have a much less value. We have a concept that a person would rather have kav shalom tisha kav and shalacherim. A person would rather have one measure, small measure of something of his own, than 9 measures of something that belong to somebody else. When we work for something, it's valuable. You know those pitchifkis in your house? The pitchifkis with the little things that have got little marks on them, and they have chips, and they're a little broken. But those things, you would never give those away because those things you worked for. Yaakov Avinu is out alone, worried about his brother coming to attack him. And he realizes that he left pachin ketanim. He left little Tupperwares on the other side of the river. That's why I explained pachin ketanim. Little disposable jugs, Tupperwares, right? Left them on the other side. And he goes to get them, and that's where he gets mugged by the angel of Esav. What in the world was Yaakov Avinu going after Tupperware? You know, there was other places he could have gone. He could have gotten more Tupperware. He didn't need to go back. He didn't need to put himself into danger for it. Why would he go back for little insignificant things? Because Yaakov Avinu knew how hard he worked for those things, how honest he needed to be, how much effort he needed to put into it, and therefore the value of those things was off the charts because he was invested in them. We find by Noach, what was God's guarantee that Noach wasn't going to turn to God in the middle of the trip and say to God, I'm out of here. God, I want a lifeboat. I'm done. What was God's guarantee? It wasn't just because it was raining, because that was done after 40 days. But the guarantee that Noach wasn't going to leave was that God ensured that Noach invested of himself. He took his own money, he took his own material, he took his own grain, and he brought that on the boat. God specifically warned him in the Torah not to take anything that belonged to anybody else, even though it was all going to be destroyed, because God wanted that he should make an investment on his own, investment of himself. Because once he invested himself in those animals, so then he became connected to them. They were valuable, and therefore he wasn't just going to turn around and abandon them. When we invest in things, when we put something into something, it means something to us. When we get something for nothing, it's called Nama de Kisufa. It's called the bread of shame. Therefore, what God wanted was he wanted us to earn our place in this world. And in order to earn our place in this world, we needed to become independent. And to become independent, we needed to work for the things that God wanted to give us. There needed to be a system of justice. There needed to be a right and a wrong, a possibility of succeeding and a possibility of failing. There was no free lunch. There was no free gift. It wasn't just on chesed. There needed to be din in this world also, because we needed to be able to know that we could lose, that we could be unsuccessful, that we might not be able to make it. And therefore, we had to constantly justify our existence. This is why I deserve to live. This is why I deserve to be the person I am. This is why I deserve the life, because I put effort into it. I give something to it. We have to justify our existence. I'm not here to receive free lunches. I'm putting something into this world also. I'm also significant. I'm also making a contribution. Now, that doesn't mean I deserve anything. There's no such thing as magili, but at least I'm making an effort. At least I am opening a pipeline that God can send his bracha, his blessing down to me. I'm making a hishtadlus. I'm doing something. I'm not just sitting and waiting for God to drop the gift into my lap. Because if that's what it was, if it was all about God's kindness, then I would be a person who feels constant shame. But to justify my existence, I need to make an effort to become independent. God's kindness is what motivated his creation, but his greatest kindness to us was to allow us to earn our own place, to earn our own existence. The only way to do that is to be judged by Elohim, to be judged by God. Okay. I need an hour for this. I apologize. But this is the principle that we're going to work on tomorrow. The principle is called Nama Tekisufa, the bread of shame. God being a mativ, God wanting to give us, but we have to earn that which he wants to give us. Just a quick last thing, where was the first manifestation of this? In the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden. Wasn't that a free gift, the Garden of Eden? No. What were the two words that God used when he put us into the Garden of Eden? We're there to la'avdo u'lashamro, to work it and to guard it. We didn't have a free ride in the Garden of Eden. We were responsible to make sure that it didn't get polluted. We were responsible to make sure that it would continue to grow, because God can't just give us something for nothing, because that would be valueless to us. Once we sinned, we had no justification for our existence. And therefore, God switched to b'ze'as ha'pecha toch halachem. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your bread. It's not such a curse. It sounds like a bad curse. It's not a curse. It's actually a reality. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your bread, which means you're going to work for what you have. It's not coming to you for nothing. Because when something comes to you for nothing, it's dangerous. Great. We'll leave it there, and we're going to pick it up from there tomorrow. You will see how this principle will answer the entire Mishnah in the most beautiful way.